like, I can't believe this many people are coming for redistricting, but then I remembered that you're all nerds. And that we all like this topic. So I want to get started. So one of the reasons, just to give you a little background on this session, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this session is because sometimes, redistricting and census can be a little wonky. And one of the things that we thought was missing was that racial equity lens. So we wanted to make sure that we pulled together a group of experts to kind of grant that lens on all the work that we've been talking about so far. So I think everybody knows what redistricting is. We talk about it a lot. But I think it's really important that as we talk about redistricting, that we're constantly connecting it to the census. Because the census comes first. Of course, it's the once-a-decade process as well. It's the process of counting every single person in the country, dividing that number to figure out how many representatives we're going to have across the country for the next decade. So I think that it's really important that as advocates, whether we're new to this topic, wherever we come from in this space, that we're remembering to connect those two topics. So I'm hoping that we can kind of shed some light on that today. So we have 3 esteemed panelists. And before we get started, I think it might be important, because we know what redistricting is, we know what census is. So let's start by figuring out racial equity and what that means. So I think it's really important for us to define that as a group, so that as we're talking through this topic, we know what lens we're coming from. So I'm going to turn it to Micah Sims. Micah Sims is Executive Director for Common Cause Pennsylvania, very popular gentleman.
So you want me to just go ahead and
You're used to taking over the floor, so I'm just going to introduce you and let you go. But no, Micah Sims, Executive Director of Common Cause. He's been a great partner in the field. He is a resident preacher and also activist organizer. But he does some tremendous work in Pennsylvania. So I wanted to kick it off to you. Give us a definition for racial equity.
So thanks again for allowing me this space and this time. I think racial equity is so important in the conversation of not just redistricting, not just census, but as we talk about democracy, period. It's going to be very hard for us to have an evolving and a more racially diverse America over the next number of decades without having a good grasp of what racial equity should look like. And so for me, I've been trying to tell people that I think racial equity is really a proactive approach of really dismantling white male-dominated structures. And not only within government, but really with democracy over the last 200 years. We have just got to face the fact that we just don't like to talk about race in America. Some people say you can declare whatever you want to be the third rail in politics. For me, it always comes down to the isms, the racism, the sexism, and things of that nature. And so when we are having these conversations about redistricting and legislation and census, I think it's so important that racial equity not only become a conversation piece, but it really has to be a value. It really has to become a behavior that a lot of our organizations, a lot of us as individuals begin to embody. We should not be having racial equity as the last point of conversation in redistricting. It really needs to be one of the first points of conversation in redistricting. Because again, I'm looking at racial equity as proactive. We should not wait 20 or 30 years after this country has gotten a little bit browner to start talking about racial equity.
Thank you, Micah. And Tram, I know that you enter this space through more language access. So talk about how the work that you're doing in this space empowers the communities that you work with.
Yeah, I approach this work through language access and through race equity, actually. And I can't agree more with what was said. When we think about achieving race equity and we think about all of the systems of oppression that is contributing to the inequities we have, it's all about systems change, right? And what is more fundamentally systemic than our democracy? And so yes, we have to start thinking about democracy reform, redistricting, all of this through that race equity lens. The language access comes in too because our communities that we engage with are new Americans. We do a lot of Black-Brown unity work. And when you think about the new American community, and I wear my Virginia state lens, the demographics in Virginia has changed so much. I grew up in Virginia. My family, it was a place where we immigrated to when they came over. in 1981 as part of the second wave of Black people. And 30 years ago, when I was 6 years old in first grade, my classmates debated in front of me whether I was black or white, because at the time, only 1 in 100 Virginians was foreign born, 1%. 3 decades later, that number is 1 in 7. And with that number comes a lot of different needs. And so language access is really important. So when we think about census and redistricting, it's how do we build bridges among all of the communities of color to talk about the importance of representation. And then how do we think about the redistricting process through that lens and engaging these communities so that they have a say in what these maps look like. They have a say in what their representatives look like. And so we've been engaging in the judicial space with Common Cause as a core partner in that, but then also in the advocacy space to make sure that when we think about commissions or we think about redistricting criteria, et cetera, that we are coming at it with a race equity first. And a language access first lens, and so that's been our approach, and we're sort of nearing the finish line like many folks are across the country.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned, that both you and Micah mentioned, coming from these different perspectives, and essentially we're talking about the systems and the process and theories around these. But how does this look in the grassroots community? So LA, this is all you.
Yes, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. I want to make sure everyone
Can we stand up?
Yes.
That'd be great.
I didn't want to suggest that, but I'm glad you read my mind. So I'm an educator by trade, so you kind of see some of my personality coming out. And that also goes into the grassroots and racial equity discussion. How do we define our communities of interest? So when we talk about redistricting and communities of interest, I'll go on from that angle. That is how we begin to redefine how our communities look and how does racial equity hold intersectionality. That's what's important. So when we are talking about the grassroots, when we go into a community, we walk into a community not just saying, oh, you're a community of color. Congratulations, that community knows that. So what else do you have to add of value to my life? Because in addition to being a black woman or a black man or an indigenous person, in addition to the Latinx community, I also have an environmental concern. So I'll give you an example of how exactly we can frame communities of interest in a way that we can define parameters that can protect communities. So here's the thing, the VRA started with a history of detriment, of violence, of pain. 3 young men were killed in Mississippi fighting at Mount Zion Methodist Church for voting rights. And their death and the burning of that church and the beating of the African American members served as the impetus for the Civil Rights Act to become in fruition, to pass, and a month later it did. Shortly after, the VRA was passed, right? And so it was finally a tool to define and quantify how we see our communities. But then, as Representative Melvin Watt, you may be familiar with Representative Watt, stated that now latter, after the successes in Mississippi by organizations like Southern Echo or Robeson County here in North Carolina, had successful redistricting reform on all 3 levels. They got rid of at-large, they did the school board all the way up to the congressional level. But what happened is the tides changed and the VRA was used, as Representative Watts said, to create racial ghettos. That's a definition. So how are we redefining those definitions to accurately represent our constituency basis? When I go in and I say, hey, in Northampton County here in North Carolina, the citizens have forged together to fight coal ash sites. That is a community of interest. Of fossil fuel and pollution infrastructure, or the natural disaster that came in Hurricane Florence. I was on the ground, and my husband and I, who's actually here, we went into the storm and delivered supplies to the very citizens we were asking to vote. Okay, if we're not talking about the communities of interest needs and identifying them as racial equity beyond just race, we miss important bridges, as what you already heard Tran mention. We miss that connectivity. What is your conversation piece beyond your minority majority? What do you know about the community? And so I'll wrap up with this. Finally, that goes into what do you know about the community? Who are your organizers and how are you paying them? Because equity also goes in your hiring practices. Because the community observes and knows disingenuous practices. Because the relationships they forge with those organizers who know their communities, who understand their people, they disappear. Why? From stress, being contracted versus salary, no benefits, no mental health days, no understanding that maybe that community organizer comes from a plethora of experience, but pain. That's intersectionality that goes into mental health. That's intersectionality that goes into career professionalism, but that's sustainability for your campaigns. You can't discuss sustainability if you don't build trust. And the quickest way to sever trust in a community is for the person they have trusted with their most vulnerable, painful moments is now gone. And your entire campaign falls flat because you did not see racial equity practices in your hiring and your retention plan to begin with. And you did not incorporate, and this is just me saying it, because I've seen it, no incorporation of these organizers in high-level discussions that directly impacts their work. They are the local experts. Their communities are local experts, and no one knows their community like an organizer. And if you miss those key conversations because they don't have a director title, which I can get to that later, racial equity, y'all, and inclusion, you miss key components and pockets in communities that are not accessible by internet because everyone doesn't have internet and broadband. I'll keep it there.
Thank you. So I think you noticed something really important, that we're having these conversations in communities, having the appropriate messengers, but how do we translate that message that we have at the grassroots level to our legislators when we're having, because you guys do have director titles, you guys have transcended. How do you shape the messages coming from the community when you have that conversation with an elected official?
So, I'll stand up. So I think one of the things that you have to be willing to do is to be open and honest with the legislator, and they may be trying to give you the BS. The reality of it is, you know, you have people of color in your districts, or you have people of color that surround your districts. And if not, guess what? At the rate, I'll talk about Pennsylvania, minorities are moving in, you will soon have them. And so it's better to be I think, in front of it than behind it. I think it's interesting because we went through this in Pennsylvania recently with a legislative bill we were trying to push on redistricting, where they did not want to have a conversation about racial equity. And I said to them, I said, wait, no offense. I know I'm the African American that really represents a large white organization in Common Cause, but you do see I am African American, right? And so they said to me, Michael, what are you trying to say? There is no way, shape, or form you can really be working on policy and not trying to include everyone. Hello, this is what I think a democracy is supposed to look like. You're supposed to have a conversation around everyone. Well, you know, it's kind of hard for us to kind of understand what racial equity is, and we don't want to get into quotas, we don't want to do any like reverse gerrymandering. See, they always have the excuses of why not, instead of giving you the reasons why they should. And I think it is important that organizations and advocates stay on the front line and go, I'm not leaving until you get this in there. And I literally said, all right, if you won't, I'll go to the office next door. And I'll go to the office next door to that until somebody hears me about having racial equity into the conversation. The other point to that is, what has to happen is people of color need people who are not of color to support racial equity. That is important in this fight, one. Two is, I also need people of racial equity not to work against racial equity. You know, my grandmama used to say, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And so sometimes in this pursuit to really work on racial equity, I have got to have that extra eye and really begin to identify, are you really with the struggle, or are you really working against the struggle? And not necessarily, the struggle doesn't always have to be about color. The struggle is just about being human, having a level of compassion to want democracy to work for everybody. So I think you got to really stick with the argument and not back down on the fact that you want racial equity in your legislation, in your initiatives, etc.
Yeah, I don't know if standing helps this issue.
Stand on the chair.
On the chair, good.
There you go, Trio. I like it.
I will just add, one way that we approach it is we actually bring our members, our community members, into the conversation. So when we are meeting with legislators and having those accountability conversations, I'm not the one having it. I am bringing actual folks who live in these communities to say, this is why this is important to us. This is why we need to keep this neighborhood, or we need to keep these neighborhoods together. I remember looking back at the 2011 redistricting cycle up in Prince William County, which is in the suburbs of DC. It's one of the fastest growing counties in the state, fastest demographic changes. And the local county board drew their magisterial districts, and they basically cut Black communities into 3 magisterial districts, and then they cut the Latino community into 3 separate magisterial districts. And they thought it was fine because they didn't expect any of us to fight back, right? And so partnering with the NAACP, partnering with a lot of local communities, we packed those rooms, those committee meetings, and went to every supervisor's office with people who live there and said, we feel like we belong together, right? We have the same concerns, we have the same shared interests. You need to redraw this thing instead of splitting us all up. And when you bring those personal stories and you bring those real life experiences, they have no choice but to listen, right? And so that worked for us in 2011. As we're going into this next redistricting cycle, we've also made sure that our voices are in the room, that they're centered. We have a court case that's pending right now in Virginia that's making its way through the federal court system and the Supreme Court on a racial gerrymander. And we worked with Common Cause to file an amicus brief around why it's so important that in remedying this racial gerrymander, this unconstitutional map, we have to look at Black communities. We have to look at the impact that it's made on us and this word I'm looking for. Anyway, that we have to fix this, right? And so that's what we're trying to do, is bring in those voices, and it's working. Our governor has made it very clear that as we're looking at reforming redistricting criteria in the state, that anything short of having explicit language that allows racial and ethnic and language minorities to participate in the political process, anything short of that, he will veto. And he has. He vetoed it last year, he will continue to do it, and that's because of the work of bringing the community into the conversation. So I think that that's a really important piece. We might have director titles, but it doesn't mean shit, to be honest. Sorry, it's really the community voices that make the difference.
And can you just, before you start, Ellie, identify the case, give people the case name just in case they want to look for it?
Oh, Bethune-Hill versus the Virginia Department of Elections. The Fourth Circuit just chose some maps that will likely be in place, but the Supreme Court has a pending hearing that we'll see what happens. But they have to do it quickly because we have elections in November, so it's all on a fast track.
Okay. So I 150% agree with both of them. And kind of following in the same vein that Tram left off or concluded with, as the title doesn't mean anything. Communities for generations have been the moving force to push the win in our favor of what we believe is a fair democracy. One case I want you all to look up, and show of hands, who has heard of the Mississippi redistricting case in the 90s? I believe it was 92. Anyone? Hey, thank you. Oh, I know you heard it. And the reason I say
I'm from Southern Echo.
well, this is, so can y'all raise your hands again, please? The Southern Echo folks, thank you. So Southern Echo, and no, I'm not from Southern Echo, but I am going to give them a plug because the level of love and adoration I have for them and their sense of community is what we're trying to answer the question here. What happens when we are faced with a General Assembly or a body of legislators who pack over half of the HBCUs in one state and one district? Oh, that was North Carolina. So when I go and speak to them, they're not going to listen to me. They knew their intentions. I am going to convince them of what they knew or know they did. That's wasting my breath. That's also wasting the time of whoever goes with me when I know that speaking to them rationally is not going to persuade them in our democracy equity sense. So I won't tell the story of Southern Echo because it's their story to tell, but what I behoove you is in the 90s, they built a community model where they split Mississippi in half and went to the top and went to the bottom and reached all their communities, actual citizen. What you saw with California, this is what Southern Echo did in the 90s. They were one of the first, if not the first, to do this. And not only did they meet with each community member, they listened to their intersectional issues and then came back. Okay, this is a long race. This is not a quick sprint, this is a marathon. So let's first really understand that this is endurance. Time and trust is not built in a month, or a calendar midterm election year, or the presidential election year. It's the between time. So with that, they met the communities, and they also taught them how to draw maps. And then when they came back, they doubled the Black Caucus, literally from 21, correct me, to 42 in 1 year. And they gave the choice, the people who were running for office, was one Democrat and one Republican, and the people stormed in there. I'm giving y'all prolific, analogies here, y'all can tell y'all something. But they walked in, and they were taken aback by the numbers of the rural people who came in knowing what their intersectionality held with redistricting. They connected the dots. And the people said, with the Black Caucus in front, because sometimes we don't use our caucuses the way we should, okay? Let's say that. They're not social clubs, okay? Just gonna throw that out there. And so with that Black Caucus, they went and they said, we will support your campaign, either Democrat or Republican, if you give us full representation in our terms. The Democrats said no. And the Republicans said yes. Guess who won? The Republican, thank you, won. But here's the punch. The Republican didn't think that they had the coordination to visibly see who the community leaders were to elect them to office. So yes, he kept his word, but he said, this is your time limit. You have to choose this many people to run for office by this deadline. Little did they know the organizing was so powerful that they already knew every single community leader from all the communities that would run for office, and they had every seat filled. Look up the case. This is how you move. It's been done. We just have to, we're not reinventing the wheel, we're understanding how to take, the VRA was taken from us, so how are we fighting with our communities and convincing legislators beyond trying to convince them elections aren't won in Raleigh or DC. They come home to win, and when you come home, your people need to be equipped with the information and education to hold not just discussions about their community, but policy as well. Give them some words. So that when they speak with their legislators, the legislators know that the people did not come to play.
Okay, thank you. So I want to back up a little bit, because what we're talking about here is when we've actually done the process well, people are moving. But we all know that communities don't always move in unison and at rapid speed like that, just overnight. So let's go back, like we can even put this on the census. Like the census, we have several cases across the country where we're talking about the inclusion of a citizenship component. So having to declare whether or not you're a citizen when you fill out your census. That is causing a chilling effect. But recently we got a very positive decision out of New York that banned the inclusion of that question. Now there's still 4 cases out there. We don't know what's going to happen. But this is a very real moment that we can use to talk about the strategies that you are employing in talking to people and getting them engaged. So how are you doing it around census and the connection with the district?
Let me talk about raise the census piece and let everybody pick up on the redistricting piece. I think whether the citizenship question makes it or not, it already has had tremendous impact in this country. And to somebody said chilling, somebody else said negative, you can add those in. So we've got to go into this with the understanding that there are people who just fit.
Tell me why. I don't know that people know why it's causing a chilling effect. Like, why are communities not wanting to participate just because citizenship?
They don't trust it. Okay, so part of them, they don't trust the government. I mean, it's a real effect that people just don't trust the government. And I'm just not talking about immigrants, non-citizens in this country. I'm talking about everyday people have gotten to a place now where they just don't trust this government. And so I was at we just had a forum in Philadelphia at a major Baptist church, mostly 95% African American in attendance, and they were raising how they are concerned about filling out the census. Because again, we're talking about going online. How much of my information is going to be stolen by a government who seemingly is totally against me? And as one old lady said, it's not only about the wall that's keeping them out, it's about the wall that's keeping some of us from doing and being the people we ought to be. She gave a great analogy of the whole wall aspect. And so when we're talking about the census and people's reluctancy to really participate, we have got to do an incredible job of talking about it now. As I explained at the forum, to see, we almost had like 75 people out, which was great in January in Philadelphia, talking about the census. In reality. So the more we do this work and start talking up the census now and addressing the issues and talking to people right where they are and assuring them that organizations like Common Cause, League of Women Voters, and everyone else are here to help people out. What we can't afford is for you not to participate. Hello, somebody. Because if we do not participate, then we've got an undercount. Then we're missing the funding. Then we're missing the representation that we're all in here fighting for right now. So it is important that we have these conversations early and often about census. And in every community, not just in one or two, but in every community, we need to be doing these things because it's just that important.
I think Micah raised a really good point about the level of trust going down, but I want to put a fine point on that. The inclusion of the citizenship question by itself may not sound very damning, but we also have penalties for people who answer questions incorrectly. Whatever that means, incorrectly is not really defined. It just means, and it usually ties to intent. So these penalties have never really been leveraged. But because of the nature and the environment that we're in today, there's fear that that may be leveraged because it exists. So I just want to put a fine point on that and let people know that the trust, it's tied to, it's not just in our heads. It's tied to something that can actually be leveraged to penalize a lot of people in this country.
Clarification question. Government in general or this current government?
Panelists? I'll let the panelists answer.
I think it's both. I think it's both, right? I think the current political environment certainly has increased the fear and the distrust of government. But for a lot of, for example, in immigrant communities, there's always been an inherent distrust of government. If you think about the folks that have immigrated this country, they are leaving a country that they've had a distrust of their own government, right? And so they don't know how the U.S. government works and how democracy here works, and so it's just inherent in their being. And then this current administration, this current political environment has just exacerbated that even more. If there is a silver lining, big fat if, to the citizenship question, it's that people are talking about the census way earlier than they have before, right? It's a part of a community conversation. Not the kind of conversation we might want to be having, but at least it's in people's minds. And so now it's up to us and up to the organizers and the trusted community leaders, members, activists, messengers to work over the next year and a half to start this conversation of why it's so important, why we can't sit on the sidelines. We have to participate in the census, not just for the funding, which is of course important, but for our democracy, right? It does link to redistricting, it links to representation, and all of this there's a thread through all of it. And at least we're having an opportunity to start that conversation way earlier than we did the last cycle. So I think that, if the big bad is, there's that silver lining, I would say that is that, because if people are raising questions proactively. I can't tell you how many times I go to one of our member meetings, whether it's in Northern Virginia, down in Virginia Beach, or in Richmond, and people actually bring it up on their own, unprompted. So what about this? What about this question? Or what about the census? And so it's a conversation starter, and I think we just have to unpack and then help folks get through that trust. And then also be real and acknowledge that fear is really real, right? And that people really don't want to answer that question. So no matter whatever happens with this court case, many court cases, and whatever the Congress and federal government decides, that is a real fear. And if that question remains on the census, there's a different conversation than it happens in the communities. And we have to overcome many more barriers to getting folks to participate. But I think people are connecting the dots, And it's our job to help them connect it even more, the census and redistricting to representation. I think one of the great things in this political moment is that more and more people are engaged. They actually understand a little bit more about how government works or how it's not working for them, that elections have consequences. And so when you start tying all of those things together, you care about education, you care about immigration reform, you care about criminal justice. It all goes back to who is representing you, right? And who represents you is tied to these maps, which is tied to the census. And so if you're connecting all of those, folks are starting to see the big picture, and they're starting to engage in a different way, which is exciting to me.
I don't believe there's much more I can add to what both Micah and Tram stated, but I will answer the question of exactly what are we doing now, briefly. After Hurricane Florence, the climate disaster as we call it, communities, as I said, that we were trying to engage with, be it voting in the midterms or redistricting during teach-ins that we do in collaboration with Common Cause, here comes the disaster, right? Midterm was a month and a few weeks away. Crazy messed up the timeline, right? How do I have an accurate, fair discussion about the census, even though people showed interest prior to the storm? How do we still bring up that conversation along with, I know your house just was swept away? How do we do that? And so before the midterms, what we did is we engaged with on-the-ground supply relief drives because it answered the needs of the community. And when we showed up with U-Hauls, we also showed up with experts to discuss the census and absentee ballots because some of the Board of Elections were closed. So there they could have an honest conversation while not being worried about their children eating lunch because we provided pizza. Not the pizza we thought they needed, the pizza the community likes. That's also something else. Let's really talk about that, right? We'll talk about that later. So during that discussion, we had experts, and through the tent, they would pick up bags, load up their cars, and say, what do I need to do? Because people don't like communities. We're not transactional in a way where just give me and I walk away. We want to earn. Even if the disaster swept everything away, I picked up supplies because I need it, but tell me what I need to do with the census. Tell me with the absentee ballot so I feel like I earned it because that's who I am. And that's what we did. Those are some examples. Another example is the way we discuss the census even now. Today in Wilmington is a Survivors Summit for Hurricane Florence. There are experts there today. We worked in coalition, Grizzly Earth worked in coalition with other groups, and hundreds of citizens are there now in a community center talking about FEMA, the census, redistricting, and why does it all matter in panels while having childcare on site and food. They are interested. It's how interested are we in involving ourselves and being connected to the communities in which we visit.
Okay, so we probably know that America is fascinated with love stories, happy endings, and all these things. So I want to tap into our civic duty as Americans to talk about what does this work have to look like in order for your job to be done? Micah, Tram, Nellie. What does it need to look like? Describe your world to us, briefly.
My world needs to look like I just get up every day. I'm being honest, because I think you have to make a personal commitment to want to see change happen. You've got to make a personal commitment to want to see racial equity within every framework that you do, and every engagement that you have with the people that you impact. I know I have a responsibility not only to my wife and my children, but I have a responsibility to humanity to try to make sure that those things that I believe in are represented in the work that I do. You know, someone asked me recently would I do this if I wasn't getting paid. And I said the reality of it is I was doing what I was doing before I was getting paid. And I will continue to do it even if I'm not paid, because I just believe in the fact that if for democracy to work in this country, everyone's got to have a seat at the table. And if I can't have a seat at the table, then guess what? I'm going to have somebody break in the room, grab the table, and take the table where everyone is. I think the other piece, and I meant to raise this earlier, is that one of the things that I have a growing concern about are organizations who work against racial equity, but yet are supposed to be in the democracy space.
I think we need to have a
key in the conversation, Micah. You don't have to name names.
I won't name names.
You need to.
But I think that is an important conversation as we're trying to really talk about fair and equal representation and a reflective democracy. If we can't have organizations to accept racial equity as a value, really as a quality, as a behavior that we are willing to exhibit as an organization, as a group, then I don't see how we can partner with them as we attempt to make sure that democracy is working for everyone. And there is going to come that moment, Selena, where we are going to have to call out people who aren't willing to say, yes, I believe racial equity is an important value in the talk of democracy. Not just something I'm willing to put on a piece of paper, but something I am willing to exhibit as my organization works on its mission and purpose. And so does that mean some of our organizations are going to have to go back and change their purpose and their mission statements? Yes, it does. And I think that's all right. Guess what? We shouldn't have been doing it in ink. We should have been doing it with pencil anyway. Because things are changing, and we must learn how to be adaptable, and we must begin to realize that, as was talked about earlier, we can't wait for people to come to us if we're going to change democracy. We're going to have to go to the people. And so you can't do that with a pen. You really have to do that with a pencil, and you really shouldn't even do it with a pencil. You should really do it with open arms, saying, how is it that we can work together to make sure that the things that are happening in this country help build you to be a better person and not a worse person.
Now, do you guys see how Micah pivoted from that hot seat question? This is why he's executive director. And I'll point out that we're also recorded, so I get it. Shreya?
I was gonna just follow that. I mean, I don't know, right? We wake up every morning and we're always facing an uphill battle. And I think to Micah's point around like being authentic in this race equity conversation. Race equity is like the term of the moment, right? It's like the it thing. I don't know how many organizations are saying, we're gonna tackle race equity. It's gonna center like all of our work for the next, our 5-year strategic plan. What does that actually mean, right? And so, yeah, for me to feel like we are winning and for us to be successful, it's really to have these authentic conversations about what do you actually mean when you say you're going to start centering race equity now? It doesn't mean just hiring some more diverse staff. And it doesn't mean then saying, hey, just call up Tram and have her explain to us some stuff. Yes. Because it's not our responsibility to teach and train to give answers. It's exhausting, right? And so I think that when you ask that question about like what it is that can help us to get to what winning looks like, I feel like it's having a lot of these authentic conversations and not putting so much pressure and responsibility on the shoulders of folks that are living these experiences every day. And that goes beyond just leaders of organizations, but even our community members. Right? When we are fighting for what we are fighting for, the change that we want to see, and it's about, I keep saying that we bring our members to these legislative conversations, we bring our members to these community forums, also recognizing that when we make that ask of our folks, that they're making their own sacrifices, right? And so like being really real about all that, I think winning is that we all have an authentic seat at the table. And people aren't speaking for us, but that also means that we can afford to have that seat at the table as well. Otherwise, we're still going to be in a place of inequity and still fighting for things that we want to see. And it's going to be a long, long time. But I think if we're willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work, then we can make progress in that direction.
So I believe today, for example, is an example of authentic conversation. Now, I understand we're not talking to you all individually, but the willingness to be here and hear us being blunt in our experiences, our own personal traumas, and sometimes the trauma of who we work with comes through us, because this is the work that we live and we breathe. These authentic conversations are here, as long as you take it beyond surface level value. And you build relationships in this room and in this conference that can serve to help your understanding, not your power, not how you can be in charge of a community of interest, but how you can add value to a community of interest. It starts here. And when you go home, it's still there even in your moments where you think that racial equity is turned off. Because what starts as what we perceive as a minority problem all becomes a problem for everyone. When I say environmental communities of interest, when a coal ash plant breaches in the Neuse River beside a black predominant populated town, that river still travels. It doesn't stop there. It comes to all of our backyards. And so if we isolate and silo, that's a word that's big, especially with, sometimes I'm a progressive, so progressive, we're siloed. And we think it can't touch us. That as long as I study it in its paradigm and leave it in the book of statistics, I and anyone who may be from my community is not a statistic. We can speak for ourselves. I am. And so this is authentic buy-in. And we have to understand that communities of interest, sometimes their experience, their cultural capital, is esteemed as highly, if not higher, as a college degree. Which means all of our playing ground is equal. And that is how we begin to build what we're doing here and foster a sense of unity from today forward. You all are a part of it. Welcome. Now, what I would say, I know I have to leave early. I'm sorry. My family and I are performing, speaking of, at the African American Cultural Celebration. And some of the students that I work with in the communities will be performing today in some of their first performances, and it's a Smithsonian affiliate. We live and breathe our work. It is who we are. And so when you approach us, it's not racial equity, it's interpersonal communication, because when I go home, I am still racial equity living.
Before you head out, I just want you to tell people one thing they can do starting today to move us forward in this work. One thing.
Ooh, one thing?
I know.
Send me an email, that's the one thing. I'm kidding. It is a great question. When you go into communities, and you are trying to build reform and legislative policies that inform, and they shouldn't inform the community should inform you. Remember that we have tables in our communities, and the goal is to be invited to our table, not just esteem your table as the only table that exists. That's it.
She took the name card off.
That was really good. I mean, I think, and that goes back to that authenticity piece, right? It's making sure that that you're being genuine in your relationships as you think and talk about race equity. I would also say the other thing that we can all do is listen better, right? Really trying to understand the experiences of the communities that we're trying to engage in. I think if you're not really listening, then you're just superficially saying, yeah, we're going to embrace you all and we're going to center you, but you're not actually coming up with the solutions that are going to address directly the root problems and surfaces. So she had the great answer.
And then walked out and left. Okay, drop the mic. And took the name. So the one thing I would say to do is to be willing to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Be willing to be uncomfortable. I say that not only as a preacher, but just be willing to be uncomfortable. And I'll say this and then I'll turn it back over to Selena. I'm a graduate of Villanova University. We have 3 NCAA basketball championships. It's really uncomfortable being at Duke University. But because this is so important, you're willing to go to the uncomfortable places. And when you are willing to go to the uncomfortable places, you will find you are there for more than just yourself. I'll give this example and then I'll sit down. I got a text message last night from a young man who is a freshman here at Duke University who said, I hear you're going to be here at Duke University. I'll catch you after the game. After the game. But I haven't seen him in a while. And I say that because you never know what new relationship or what old relationship you're going to be able to either reignite or build upon when you get into uncomfortable spaces. Because I say this, we have more in similarities than we really do have in differences.
So I want to thank the panelists. I also want to open it up to questions so that we have a little time. We'll have to channel LA's energy through the panel. So I want to open it up to questions. We have about 10 minutes. Anybody have a question? In the back of the room in green.
Hi, Simone Holding from Arizona Pollution Commission. I just wanted to, a lot of times in this space, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of times we talk about the bigger picture, but if we could break down, if the panelists can give some ways, some practical ways when we talk about allyship, what that looks like to be an ally, if we can just give some examples of what that looks like, I think it would be great.
So the question is how to break down allies into some simple steps. Creating allies, building allies.
So I will, Simone, why are you asking that question? You do it already well. Where you are. For me, I go far left, far right, and middle. For an example, I will, Common Cause intent in Pennsylvania is not only to work in the urban community, but I'm also reaching out to the rural community. And so we've got strong partners like the NAACP and the Urban League in Philadelphia, but we also now are developing really strong allies with the Farm Bureau. That's important because what I'm finding out is there are a lot of similarities between what's happening in rural Pennsylvania and urban Pennsylvania. Broadband, education, etc. So we're finding ways to do that. And then you have to find those groups that are also in the middle. I think as long as someone is willing to work for the good of everyone, I think it's worth having a conversation. I think you allow them into the space. And then when they find out that the space is not for them, they'll find their way to the door. They will. They will see that this is a little bit too much. I know right now in Pennsylvania, I'll share that I do a lot of this to progressives who, in Pennsylvania who want to oh my God, I can't deal with the legislator because they're too Republican. And I'm going, listen, we've got to figure out how to work together. Just in case, you progressives don't remember, your Democratic folk 10 years ago drew bad lines. And so for us, democracy is not about party, but it's really about values. So finding people who have a really good value set. And also realizing that there are some things that we think we know, we really don't know until we hear from people who are in that particular space. So be willing to have that shared space and listen to them and be willing to bring them to the table.
So we're a multiracial, multi-ethnic organization. And I think over the years we have been very deliberate about creating those intentional spaces for those hard conversations where people can be a little bit uncomfortable. We have a People's Congress every year, for example, that brings in our Latinx and our AAPI community members from Northern Virginia with our Black community members down in Richmond and Hampton Roads who care about very different things, but creating a space where they can learn from each other. It's always messy. It's organized chaos sometimes, but they're having real conversations with each other and learning. So when we do our MLK Day of Action every year, and we have hundreds of our members from across the state come and tell their stories to legislators, you have one of the most beautiful things that I think I witnessed in our General Assembly session was when, at a 7 a.m. committee meeting, when our legislators were hearing a bill around sanctuary policies and law enforcement within our immigrant community. And it was 7 a.m. and our immigrant rights community leaders and members could not show up, right? Because it was in Richmond and they live in Northern Virginia and it just wasn't accessible for our citizens. Our criminal justice leaders, African American leaders in the Richmond area showed up for them and testified and told their stories on their behalf because they realized how important it is and we have this shared values and shared unity, right? And so it's creating those spaces, knowing that it's going to be messy and people are going to sometimes have a deer in headlights look when they're trying to learn about a new issue or how certain things are impacting different communities. But unless you're actually trying to have that conversation, you're never gonna have it, right? And so you just try to be uncomfortable and try to build as many of those bridges as possible. So yeah, we create, like at the local level and at the state level, spaces where our different chapters with the different races and ethnicities and even languages, right? Like we'll have live interpretation at a criminal justice hearing that's predominantly, the predominant attendance are Black community members. So if we have a limited English proficient individual who wants to show up and learn about the issue, they can be there. So I think it's being very deliberate and intentional about those little things that actually make a difference.
Other questions? We're in the back room.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. Two things. One, I just want to know if anyone knew the specific name of the case that was referenced by the panelists. And in reference to allyship, I just wanted to stress the importance of not waiting until you're invited to another person's table before challenging inherent anti-blackness, inherent white supremacy, and privilege that comes through, because that will lead through strategy sessions, planning sessions, and ultimately into the maps that are finally created. So I want to make sure that work is being done in advance of agenda setting, so that as agenda setting is happening, we can navigate without having to get through all the
And I think you're talking about the
Mississippi case.
Give us the short version of what she asked,
Okay, Laura.
because I didn't quite get the whole thing. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
so one, she was asking for the name of the case. That's the easy part of your question. And then the second part was making sure that we are doing the work of racial equity at all levels at the forefront of these processes so that it doesn't seep into the process as they start. Other questions? Gentleman in the back? Denim shirt? Yep.
Hey, thank you all so much for your time. I have a question just regarding, I guess, kind of strategy in states where you can't pass ballot initiatives, such as here in North Carolina, where we know when more people come out to vote, when more people participate in the democratic process, you often see more progressive, more black and brown, a better reflection of the United States, which we also know that sometimes our conservative friends don't necessarily want to see. And so what do you do when you speak with Republicans who sit in the legislature to convince them to pass or to agree to things like gerrymandering, redistricting reform, not having voter ID bills, when in reality that means more people get to participate and it might mean they might lose power?
Man, that's the $1 million question. But great question, thanks. In Pennsylvania, we are a Republican-dominated legislature. I go in and remind them kind of what things were like when they weren't in the majority. I tell them whether it's karma, whatever you believe, chances go round. And the reality of redistricting is you would rather have citizens drawing maps than people you have pissed off in session for the last 2 years, or 4 years, or 10 years. Because trust me, when they're pissed, they're pissed. How do I know? Because you just drew a map recently that showed how pissed you were at Democrats. And so I think keeping that in, I think one of the things that it's about relationships. Finding again where people really have some commonality. I thank God every day that my relationships within the legislature are on both sides of the aisle. I am a registered Democrat, but I run a nonpartisan organization. So when I go into meetings, I'm not here for D's or R's. I'm in here representing 12.8 million residents of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we have to do what's in the best interest of them. And so I'm here lobbying you to get off of your political agenda and really get on your human agenda. How would you feel if someone drew a line through your backyard just because you wanted to disenfranchise or dilute or crack or pack particular districts? I think the most difficult challenge for me is not Republicans. The most difficult challenge for me is dealing with Democrats who are sitting there just going, I can't wait till we get control of the maps. We're going to get them back. And I'm going, I'm telling you, what you don't want to do is have that type of attitude. So I think it's about changing the environment, changing the atmosphere by which people begin to see nobody, no party should want to be drawing maps. People should be drawing maps, not parties. And then that allows the people to pick their representatives. And guess what? If you're a good elected official, and you really know your constituents and you know what's right, you'll win. But guess what? If you don't, you'll lose and you'll go find a job and do something else. But to your point, yeah, it is really about just trying to figure out how to make them understand that chances really do go around. And the best thing to do is to really have people working on maps. That's just the reality. And there's enough grassroots momentum right now within redistricting. And, you know, I always point when I'm in meetings, look at what happened in Colorado. Look at what happened in Michigan. Look at what happened in Ohio. You know, it's coming. Hello, it's coming here to Pennsylvania real soon. You want to get in the position where you can help that and not be run over by it.
I do think Mike has a really great point. I also want to say sometimes we just have to be creative in these processes. When I was working in Georgia as legal counsel during redistricting cycle, the last redistricting cycle, they told me that I would not be able to pass bills because we were in the minority, and I passed 9. So it can happen. I think that we talked a lot today about grassroots advocacy, but you also want to leverage grass tops. Who are the leaders? And these could be previously elected officials, because Democrats, while it may seem like Democrats are brown people, that's often a message and a narrative. Back in the day, Democrats were white Southerners. So, and they're still alive, still active. Sometimes you just gotta find them, call them up and say, hey, I need your help. So I think depending on what's going on in your state, sometimes you have to get really creative, but I would leave no stone unturned. Try everything until something works. So we're almost at time. We have probably one more question that we can do. We'll take the gentleman in the front.
I'll stand here so everybody can hear. Yeah, we talked a lot the last couple of days about democracy works best when all people are involved, or as many people involved. And one of the problems I have is talking to people that essentially buy their democracy. They don't care what happens because they can afford to buy the world however they want to buy it. And they don't want to participate, and they don't want to talk. They won't slam the door in your face when you go in, whether you knew them for a day or whether you know them for 10 years. They do not want to talk about democracy. They don't want to talk about racial equity. They don't want to talk about gerrymandering, maps, or anything else. So I'd love to hear you two respond to those kind of circumstances when you got somebody up that's wealthy and powerful in whatever way, shape, or form, and doesn't want to participate in a place where we all got to be, bail on the boat. And if we're not all bail on the boat, it's going to tip over. And they don't see that, they don't feel that, and they think that the world's going to work out for them. Yet they got 15 grandchildren that are coming along behind them that they're not sharing that with.
That's a hard one. I mean, honestly, it's true. I mean, we deal with that every day, right? In Virginia, for instance, we don't have campaign finance laws. 0. It's the wild, wild west. And so, yes, folks who are wealthy, who have money, who can make those contributions and buy essentially access, politicians are listening to them a lot more. But what we're trying to do, what we have been doing for the last decade is trying to upend that a little bit, right? When we think about power, when we think about how we achieve power, I think about it in sort of 3 buckets. Through organizing, right? You organize your ideas, what you want to see happen, the change that you're trying to make. You organize people, right? And you organize some money. But really, people power, if you can get there and be super organized around it and actually tell those stories and bring those folks out, you can start to really change. Start to really change the conversation. We have very powerful folks in our state legislature. We're actually in the middle of our 6-week legislative session right now. We've got 3.5 weeks left. It's almost done. But you knock on those doors, you try to reach those offices, and sometimes they look out and they say, oh, that's a lot of black and brown people. I don't have time for them. Right? And then they send their LA to have the conversation. And so, but you keep showing up year after year, and now we're in those offices. We're having those conversations. So I think it's persistence, but I think it's really hard. I agree that folks tend to slam the door because they don't feel like they need us. But we've seen Virginia change over the last decade because people are paying more attention, people are more engaged, elections have consequences, and people are seeing that. And the consequences that different people are voting, the electorate's expanding, and so we're changing the definition of what democracy means, and I think that's how you start to win.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Mike, for the